So I was going to speak to you about my recent book, The Architecture of Closed Worlds, which is an ongoing project that this book was released in 2018. And it was a fairly ambitious, I can't say in any way complete effort to rewrite the history of 20th century architecture, design, and engineering via the conceptualization and production of several different spaces as closed systems. I have argued that a lot of the contemporary discussions that we're having today about global warming, recycling, and sustainability have emerged as direct conceptual artifacts related to the study and analysis of closed systems. These range from countercultural projects in the 1960s and 70s that experiment with autonomous living, to military experiments to secure the sovereignty of outer space. Closed worlds in many ways document, in my view, a disciplinary transformation and the rise of an environmental consensus in the 20th century, where we take the principles of law and nature and transfer them almost directly to the domain of cities and buildings. While these ideas derive from a deeply rooted fantasy of architecture, which is meant to produce nature, closed worlds are embedded in every way that we live in the fabric of reality in our contemporary cities and buildings. So the title of the book, Closed Worlds, references, as you see here, Rainer Banham's famous book of 1969, The Architecture of Well-Tempered Environment. But at the very back of the book, there is an uglier subtitle, which is, What is the Power of Shit? And I will talk about this ugly part today, not about the canonical history of environmental technology, arguing that in order to write a counter-history to the idealization of circular economies and the way that we idealize sustainability today, we need to look at shit because it engulfs and surrounds our existence in more ways that we want to observe and acknowledge. And I will begin by sharing a little video to you, which was displayed at the Istanbul Biennial of 2016, which was curated by Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomina. And this biennial actually was designed by I don't know what's the male word for mistress, by my lover, Andrés Jaque. In this venue, and this is the installation, I assembled 5 holograms, and they were displayed at the little plexiglass pyramid that you see on the screen with this little floating man, and you had to lie down to see them. And one of them, the video that I'm going to share with you, was called Excrement Man. And here it is.
Every day, our country must find a place to park 5 billion gallons of human waste, and we appear increasingly unable to find the space. Municipalities across the Every day, our country must find a place to park 5 billion gallons of human waste, and we appear increasingly unable to find the space. Municipalities across the states constantly deal with sewage spills, and the nightmare is only getting worse as a never-ending stream of people descend upon our cities. More human beings means more human fecal matter.
You're about to see, like the shit of 1 million people seething into one gigantic methane fart. Here we go, Vinny.
Excrement Man. The manure of 1 billion gallons is undertaking a long and torturous journey to be shipped to several processing facilities and sewage plants. The 1970s, following the oil crisis, saw the rise of methane digesters, biofuels, and homemade reprocessing devices to convert human excrement to
I hope you can hear it.
The prevailing logic was that all living bodies and organic materials should be at the disposition and distribution of natural ends and reciprocal uses. The death of one thing should always be subservient to the restitution of another. Recurring restitution promised a new world that would recycle materials perpetually and feed all leftover substances back into cycles of production. The desire for the absolute purging of waste, even human excrements, also appears in several experimental projects, like Graham Kane's Ecological House in London, Sim van der En's book The Toilet Papers, and Stefan Sokolkin's survival scrapbooks, all articulating the ultimate eco-social fantasy for a world of no loss by reusing man's organic excretions. In The Toilet Papers, van der Rin introduces the book by claiming that waste speaks of an incomplete perception of the world. He writes that the word waste is used to refer to those materials, feces, and urine your body passes on to make energy available to some other form of life. This is what you give back to the earth. The idea of waste, of something unusable, reveals an incomplete understanding of how things work. Nature admits no waste. Nothing is left over. Everything is joined in the spiral of life. Perhaps other cultures know this better than we, for they have no concept of, no word for waste. A major influence at the time was the Gobar biogas movement flourishing in India on the topic of assembling methane generators. Rambuk Singh directed biogas experiments for 2 decades at a research station in northern India, having developed more than 200 low-cost digesters designed to convert plant and animal waste into composited fertilizer and methane for fuel. He invented a chemical method, which not only accelerated the fermentation and decomposition in the composting process, but also resulted in the formation of a valuable byproduct, combustible gas. During the early 1970s, the bibliography on the topic of methane generation boomed, while the work of Rambuk Singh, whose fame spread to Britain and the United States, was popularized through the Whole Earth catalog and Mother Earth News, along with Colin Moorcraft's recycling section in architectural design. The idea of homemade power, running a car or heating a house with non-polluting fuel that is generated in one's own backyard, was attractive to patrons of the environment disillusioned with oil spills, strip mining, and smog. It was also attractive to avid supporters of a social political ideology. At the same time, however, similar concerns of privatization and hence denationalization expressed the extreme right. Alternative technology maintained a double-faced posture at the 2 poles of the political cycle, which eventually meet and piece or compose the ideology of individualization.
Thousands of farmers and retailers are doing the same thing with this new global product. Human fecal matter is being used in tons of ways all around the country and the world. An estimated 10 million Chinese farmers use raw sewage to irrigate and fertilize cropland, and they've been doing it for thousands of years. Wine vineyards grow their grapes on biosolids. This ski resort in Arizona uses poop water to make snow. You may have flushed it down the toilet, but it doesn't go away. This is the beginning of a zero-waste society.
The reuse of human and animal excrements opened up the possibility of a new world, one that could recycle materials perpetually and feed all leftover substances back into cycles of production. These efforts recuperate an ancient mystery of material transitions in invocation of infinity through the perpetual transformation of matter.
Every day.
So I'm going to continue from that point to bring you to a diagram by, well, actually that's my diagram, but it comes from the text of Hungarian psychoanalyst Sandor Ferenczi, who argued that shit and money exhibit 2 sides of the same coin. Shit is ejected from the body and rejected from the psyche, whereas money is introjected by the body and accepted by the subject as a highly desired form. Nevertheless, both entities derive from the same prime matter in an ongoing recycling process of serial transformation, where shit assumes different material stages and rolls all the way to money. In this sense, based on this psychoanalytic theory, materials exist only in stages while they absorb qualities from previous stages. Mud is shit deodorized, sand is mud dehydrated, pebbles are sand hardened, and coins and pebbles are unearthed. This affinity is not just a matter of theory and psychoanalysis. It also becomes a factual constituent of capitalist production. There's a long history of converting shit to money. Roman Emperor Vespasian, for example, invented the phrase pecunia non ole, money does not smell, to explain the taxation for the usage of public urinals and to expurgate the dishonorable act of defecation. From the experimental processes of alchemists to Freud's anal sadistic phase, recycling shit to money is as much a subject of theoretical analysis as a factual constituent of capitalism. Waste needs to go away, and the process of purging, transporting, and carrying into oblivion all that is worthless is utterly profitable. In recent history, the latest market bubbles do not grow from the exchange of carbon dioxide emission between countries in compliance with the Kyoto protocols. They grow from the trading of urban waste. Congested metropolitan environments like New York produce massive amounts of solid waste and sewage that is then transported out of the city. The purging of this waste is invisible to our perception, yet it generates capital for those who manage and transfer the raw materials. New York City, the beating heart of global finance and culture, is home to more than 8.5 million people who create an enormous amount of poo. This is the train that takes all of this poo from New York City to Birmingham, Alabama, where all of the sewage is expelled, causing major stink methane clouds 900 miles away. The treated sewage, euphemistically known in the industry as biosolids, travels with a train to a landfill, causing what the locals there call the death smell. Since the Environmental Protection Agency decided in 1988 that it was not a great idea to dump waste into the ocean, where to put New York's fecal matter has become a very big challenge for a city that creates about 1,200 tons of sewage every day. In Alabama, the avalanche of northern poo is part of a wider concern of environmental risks for residents, particularly for people that are impoverished and people of color. Further south, a landfill bordering the majority of African-American settlements of Uniontown contains 4 million tons of toxic coal ash and welcomes other debris from 33 states. The dismissal of such concerns by Alabama residents, mostly residents of overwhelmingly African-American communities, has been reported as a case of civil rights and environmental racism. In this way, shit and where it goes and what happens to it forces us to look at questions of ecology viscerally, via the raw ecology of our bodies, not through statistics and through a distance, but through shared material evidence, and the understanding that recycling is not an abstract problem related to the management of urban resources, but also a bodily reality that affects, in a very real sense, the air and the water that we drink. As Donna Haraway recently wrote in her latest book, Staying with the Trouble, I'm a compostist, not a post-humanist. We are all compost, not post-human. While the displacement of shit from New York City to Alabama is highly curated, it transfers the problem to disenfranchised terrains. Therefore, the question of how to handle, retain, pile, decompose, and redistribute waste is not simply a technical problem related to the trading of carbon emissions, but a matter of justice and equity. Retaining waste on site and designing the infrastructure on how to live with our excrements enclosed in this case that you see on the screen in anaerobic digesters is an opportunity that may have long-term environmental and health benefits, despite the upfront cost of investing in specialized digestive infrastructural machines. Indigenous cultures have long pioneered the management of waste without ignoring and expelling it. In designing such infrastructural machines that recycle waste to energy as inhabitable living spaces, the premise is that humans could coexist with the material consequences of their living processes. In the toilet and the garden that you see in the image on the screen, feces are separated from urine and digested in an integrated toilet/garden/auditorium space. Human excrement becomes nutrients for soil and produces methane to power in a hydroponic aquaponic garden. The toilet, therefore, becomes a central social space for the life support system, and the social dynamics and attitudes toward ablution spaces would no doubt change. Foreseeably, this possibility could compel us to reinvent the politics of our territorial dimension. Similarly to Sandor Ferenczi, who argued that shit equals money, the logic of regeneration and feedback has been absolutely instrumental in promoting sustainability and generating capital investments through the popularization of circular systems and circular economies. The premise that in addition to money, shit might equal food has become increasingly popular. It can generate methane, meaning power, if treated properly. In this logic, the life and metabolism of living creatures is decoded, processed, and transposed to industrial systems, advocating for a full circle of life with no loss. One must yet be aware of the false sense of holism that this premise engenders and its delusion of fulfillment. A closed regenerative system insulates itself from receiving environmental input as well as discharging output. Ultimately, it functions like an improvisatory sealed structure that regenerates new conditions out of what is available within systemic borders. In a closed system, any modification occurs internally, affecting the organizational structure of the system. Oftentimes, these structures are entirely unpredictable in the way that their organization changes abruptly. Ecological systems are in this sense, in fact, digestive machines, like giant stomachs, so they're sometimes disobedient. This is what autonomy means in many respects. Even if we wish to portray ecosystems as robust and as whole in their circularity of matter, where waste equals food, the idea of self-sufficiency is compulsive and hysteric in the will to ceaselessly generate new life from all wasteful cycles of production. In that way, we must not renounce circularity, but deviation and redundancy, and enhanced, not marked as errors. Let us not forget that more than a material, shit also indicates a general state of incoherency, degeneration, and malevolence. It indicates a stage where information is so finely grained and scattered that it cannot form bonds and cohere into certain patterns. In this stage, information is unrefined, randomly grained, and it is interrelational loss or incohesion between bits and particles that defines its degenerate condition. And this position asks architects to investigate the full spectrum of life in all its living systems, materials, and components as a complex intertwining of overlapping ecologies and the way they unfold in space and in time. In this way, the notion of a spatial environment takes on a new role. Instead of being the inactive, static, and historicized context of an architectural object, the environment quite literally becomes the object of design itself. And speaking of shit, I would like to speak of it not only as a material, but as a methodology, a research methodology. Reusing, I will recall shit to debris, the debris of one's own research. So a lot of my work, and this is a reflection of what I do, because unlike Andrés, that's an architect, I'm operating on the fringes of a discipline, and I'm still trying to figure out how to position what I do. A lot of my work begins from the examination, redesigning, and animation of archives. I see an archive not as a static object that contains historical documents, but as an immersive space and a living collection where existential ideas about world orders migrate through different architectural and spatial typologies. And this is an image of the exhibition Closed Worlds in New York, which is where I met Andrés, actually, where that eerily reminds us of social distancing protocols. Each of these cylinders were exactly 6 feet, which is the required distance for social distance. People think that it's prophetic. It's actually not. It was the idealization of the personal bubble, which was Edward Hall's proxemic theory in 1966. But here, the idea was to inhabit information, to visualize the archive not as a didactic display, but to create a space which can be immersive. Designing an archive is not only about curating and categorizing found objects as a didactic act. It enables journeys between different times, places, and objects of investigation. These journeys are temporal and spatial at once. They allow us to inhabit and digest spaces, stories, and locked secrets. When archival objects are reactivated, we are not quite sure whether they're from the past or the future. While working on closed worlds, or for any project on that matter, I am compelled to pursue different modes of research, including historical archival surveys, technical reports, data management, investigations on alternative formats of representation, drawings, lexicon, and databases. Diversity is critical to my work, not only in the analysis of each project's content, but also in its forms of dissemination and display. This is the archive of the Closed Worlds project, but what did not make it into the actual canonical archive became a part of this, which was a minor history, which were 3 interlinked threads to the original archive. And all the words that did not make it to either of the minor histories or the archive became an online platform, a lexicon of environmental history, which you can find online, which takes in a canonical hierarchical order alphabetically all the words that I have encountered that I thought had spatial consequences. In this way, a main line of investigation created something like research debris along the way of its production, and the debris was reconstituted in other means of representation: net zero diagrams, graphic elements for an exhibition, drawings, words, virtual reality environments, documentaries, even floor seating. This modality of reviving the debris of one's own research and ideas makes evident that in the history of ideas, discourses get recycled. Materials in closed worlds are not the only items that we recycle. Concepts emerge as allegedly new, but ideas undergo long journeys of migration from one epistemological field to another. Contrary to a building or a book, the archive creates new forms of authorship. The cycling process of ideas, as in the case of reusing what I tentatively call the debris of your own research, is also a form of resistance to a project's linearity or causality to respond to a solution, to respond and create a solution to particular problems. Recycling becomes a disruption to an idealized continuum or a productive distraction to the arrow of time. As the father of general systems theory, Heinz von Forster, has argued, it is favorable to have some noise in a system. If a system is going to freeze into a particular state, if inadaptable, it may be altogether wrong, incapable of adjusting itself to a more appropriate state. For it is not simply information that matters, but also noise. It is not simply space that matters, but also waste. What appears as noise at one level of reference, one scale, may become useful input in another level of reference, in another scale. And this is the line of this work. The surplus of means and mediums that become byproducts of other mediums constitutes an intentional view which is out of focus. It reflects the conditions of the world as a heap of waste, a coagulation of ideas, bodies, platforms, objects, displaced from context and history. Our world of climate emergency, health crisis, and social inequity. Thank you.
I think the way Lydia, not only the content of and the findings and the outcome of her work, but also the way she works, the way she's producing this network of projects, people, institutions. It's something to learn from, and a fundamental part of the discussion of climate and environment at large. And this is something that for me it's very exciting, and also is constructing new trajectories, looking backwards to rethink the future. And within these genealogies, I think the work of Georgi Kepes also, I wanted to bring it here as a possibility of thinking of architecture as a constellation of interconnected entities that are heterogeneous and that could be seen as entangled, as not self-contained and not zipped up. This is something that it's been a huge discussion in architecture, but a discussion that often it's been rather hidden. This is a 1968 movie by the Office of the Nieves, Powers of 10, that you probably know, the third version that they actually released, that was based on the research of Judith Bronowski, the daughter of the famous scientist, that was basically producing an architecture that most people did not perceive as architecture, an architecture that was claiming the possibility of non-discontinuity across scales, kind of multi-scalar architecture that could connect DNA with the universe through bodies, through parks, through lawns. This is something that I would like to discuss, and how that was actually a way to start probably, or to be part of a discussion that was already starting on ecology in the 1970s, in the late 60s in LA. And this is something, of course, that links the work that I've done with the work of Lydia, who's been reflecting on zooming in, zooming out, and scaling architecture intensively, and it's been a huge reference for me. I would like to talk about the frame, the idea of centering architecture across scales, the possibility of architecture to operate as a frame of the social, a frame that was basically containing and putting in the center kind of an idealized version of what nature could be, embodied in this couple. The image is very much fabricated through the Hollywood industry, as Beatriz Colomina, a close friend of Lydia and myself, has been exploring for years. Actually, the origin of this movie's Cosmic View, this film, this book by Kees Boeke. And when we see Kees Boeke, when we understand that what he was doing, he was trying to challenge democracy. He was challenged democracy with the idea of sociocracy, this idea of the consensual society where diversity could be eliminated to provide efficiency. Center societies that could basically be much more efficient, but at the stake of imposing the criteria and the sensitivities of the majority. They were actually Betty Cadbury, Kees Boeke's partner, and co-author of all the theories that and experiences that had been credited to Kees Boeke, was the daughter of one of the founders of Cadbury Chocolates, the British company, and they basically were applying to pedagogy and to this book what they had learned in the experience of co-designing company towns for Cadbury that would optimize the capacity of workers to basically produce together and for industrial production. The second element of this is the zoom, of course. This is a 1957 Angelo Nyosh zoom that was the one that was popularized through the Nouvelle Vague. When we look in detail, the zoom, it's basically it's black boxing very literally the transition between very heterogeneous lenses. But the possibility of hiding the artificiality of this transition, the effects of transitioning from one lens to the other, was basically what the zoom would provide, this kind of sense of non-discontinuity that only very trained eyes could detect when the focus moves from one lens to the other. And that was basically what the images were doing. This is one of the notes from Judith Bronowski, where she was basically preparing storyboard of one of the slides of the storyboard that was rejected by Charles Eames, because by copying from this book, looking at chromosomes, she included the chromosome, this one here, of a Down syndrome cell, or cell that was affected by Down syndrome. The same here, there was a virus attacking a cell, and therefore, because they were not what was supposed to be canonical cells under attack, or cells with a difference, where this photogram was eventually eliminated. What it's been important for me, and that was the base on this work, Superpowers of 10, is challenge this non-discontinuity, introducing diverting stories, making this kind of line of progression something that was problematic, that included diversity, that included, for instance, the fact that not the canonical bodies were not even representing those that were working in this movie, like Philip Morrison, that was that was basically affected by a number of diseases across his life. He was also the guy that, with his own hands, placed the bomb that was used to attack Hiroshima. And afterwards, he became an anti-nuclear proliferation activist, having been before part of the Manhattan Project, and as I said, the one that basically placed the bomb in the airplane. But he was also a kind of activist for the existence of extraterrestrial life. He was defending that in papers that he wrote for Nature. He was actually behind the construction of this antenna in Ohio, Big Ear, that ended up actually receiving messages from out of the earth living intelligence that eventually were found false. The Lawn, for instance, was the result, of course, of a huge reduction. The Lawn on which the picnic is happening was the result of a huge reduction of biodiversity that operated in the world since the 50s, and which are brilliant. The product is this kind of designed species of grass that was basically growing very slow, and that was defined by the New York Times as a suburbanite's dream, would also be part, of course, of that story. And even the film on which the movie was shot, that was this famous Kodachrome that was calibrated with these Cindy cards, that was the image of an employee of Kodak with very, very light skin, that would basically become the focus of a huge backlash at the time of the civil rights, because it was not depicting other skins. And not only that, but the very connection between chromosomes and gender was already quite controversial in 1968 in California, where the LGBTQ community was very radical, and no one in California in the cultural circles were not aware that there was a trans movement that was already placed in the city and very active. Judith Bronowski, to whom I've been interviewing for years now, was saying basically we were not allowed to talk politics in the office, even though everyone knew that those trips that Charles was doing constantly to Washington were connecting the office with the Pentagon. And when you put all these realities together, you see that we're very different to the line of progression that the images depicted. Actually, the constitution of our transcolor realities is much more complex, is much more problematic, is much more non-linear. And this is, for me, also what design connects with research. I believe that architecture is really the disposition of facts and realities, is how realities compose together for me, this is a piece of architecture, an urbanism, and as such can be used and can be inhabited, like this image, for instance, of Bruno Latour, inhabiting this setting as a way to change the way our understanding of technology can be constructed now, can be claimed now. And this is what basically we've been doing in the last years with projects that are kind of mixing and intersecting research, activism, and design. And it's what it's also been collected here in this very recent book that came out very recently. I would like to now speak of a couple of projects and about New York, a couple of projects that we're developing now and that I would like to explain a little bit very rapidly. The first is the Center for TBA 21, the Thyssen-Bornemisza Contemporary Art Collection in Venice. TBA 21 is a very unique art institution because it's basically focused on the ocean. And they actually have different centers around the world in Jamaica, boats where scientists work together with artists, and they're trying to change the common culture and come up with new forms to describe, to sense the ocean. That's the origin of this commission of this to transform San Lorenzo Church, the former San Lorenzo Church and a number of other buildings around it into the ocean space. And of course, Venice is ocean in a very radical way. There's no way to claim that there's a divide between Venice, its geography, and the ocean. And actually, the way Venice is being depicted historically is very much as an alliance between humans and non-humans through ideology and through technology. The technology, for instance, of the cross that falls into the canal and then is brought back by the mediation of God, but operating through the water of the canal that rejects the cross and give it back. This is for me an image that I would say is architectural. It's an architectural plan of how the civil society is composed as this ecosystem where humans and non-humans are negotiating their alliances and describing what are the contracts that keep them together. This is, of course, part of this church, and our role is being reconstructing this materially or trying to reconstruct this civil society alliance by the introduction and kind of rearticulation of the way the people in Venice with commerce, with the artists, scientists that would live here, and with the ocean could happen. A work that has to do with the creation of a ground that multiplies and that allows for other forms of relationship to emerge, a form of relationship that could flow in alliances that now are not that likely to happen, and that it's done through very simple operations, like for instance, change this into this, or for instance, allow particular parts of the buildings to go out, to extend outdoors and become places where the geography of the world and the sensing capacity of the TBA 21 network could be basically monitored from here, like a little bit of a open control room for the environment, and a number of other devices, and changing a little bit of a basically usable ground that allows to adapt to the changing requirements of these alliances between artists and scientists and policymakers and activists and victims. And one of the most difficult things is how to basically bring nature in the alliance of non-humans, which is very materially loaded in the way Venice is constructed. And these are the foundations of the building, and the wood of the original building came from the Bosco di Casilio, like most of the foundations from Venice, which actually is for me is fundamental to understand the way architecture operates at different scales, as interconnected and entangled with the evolution of the forest. That forest actually is now mostly disappeared. But this is also a project of dissidence to the way the presence of nature is controlled and evacuated. And these are, for instance, ways for the ocean also to emerge in Venice that we're prototyping how to bring back to particular experiments. This is the green line, the famous green line in Venice that is moving and that is actually becoming space to sense climate. And this is fundamental because climate is something that brought the need for medium and media and the need for inquiring practices and devices, and architecture again has the possibility of monitor, make visible, explain, provide a medium for climate evolution to be sensed, and many, many other things that are meant to multiply the possibility for nature to become part of or be allied with architecture. This is something that comes to the probably the most difficult part is how to sense remote dimensions of the oceanic and the capacity of TVA21 to deploy sensing devices across the world and in places that are now at stake and under political discussion. It's bringing the possibility for civil society to emerge as with a voice in ongoing disputes where the presence and the representation of non-humans, and by non-humans in this case I mean, for instance, the biodiversity in the on the seabed that is now being harassed or kind of attacked by deep sea mining, could happen by rethinking the tradition of frescoes and actually invading with this kind of elevated parliament for the ocean, the domes of San Lorenzo Church, and use digital technology to connect with the to bring the presence of the deep sea at the table where it could be discussed with policymakers. This is the stage of the first phase of this floor, and it's connected to this very tiny project for us that is a house in Corpus Christi in the lagoon, a place that traditionally was thought to have no ecological value because it was a brownish lagoon like this, but it's now being considered one of the most valuable lagoon ecosystems that is attacked by the acidity that the pollution of the ocean is bringing. Basically, this industry that is unfold historically in Texas, is anticipating the erosion, or is provoking the erosion of these islands, and the only element that is retaining them is this very fragile vegetation. The project that is occupying is a cabin that is occupying one of these tiny islands here, and it's part of an association with a number of institutions and organizations that are already working to transform the culture of the lagoon and instigate practices of preservation, reparation, mitigation, and adaptation to sea level rise and and it's here. This is our cabin. And for me, what is interesting is that it's not a cabin for humans. It's not an architecture of primarily designed for humans, but actually it's for the environment as a whole, and for the preservation of the vegetation. That basically it's the only way to slow down, not to avoid the erosion of these tiny islands that protect this archipelago that protects the lagoon, and that it's in its borders is where the habitat of a big number of species, of which the persistence of the lagoon ecosystem depends, are located. And when I say it's not primarily for humans, it's because basically this cabin is being designed as a device to collect water in different ways, through condensation, but also through basically accumulation of rainfall or collection of rainfall. And it's the entire system is equipped with sensors. So when the acidity of the ground elevates, jeopardizing the life on the islands, basically water is released. and reducing automatically this acidity and maintaining and contributing to help the maintenance of the vegetal coverage of the island. And I would like to conclude with a reflection on Manhattan and New York at large. And New York as not a city, but I would say a larger transcolor enactment. And it's very important for me in the context of School of Architecture to question how we approach to the analysis of a building like this. This is a building that often is perceived as very elegant, formally. I was very happy with the way Lydia explained how the notions of architecture, the objectual notions of architecture are challenged by the way climate is being depicted, mobilized, analyzed, dealt with ecology, material cycles, the material transformations, like being challenging the notion of the building as an object. And still, it is often that we see buildings like this and they're analyzing the context of architecture as elegant, beautiful, simple, good design. Whether it's part of nasty things or not, that's another issue, and it's not architect's role to think of that. It's just part of the context that architecture happens in. My claim would be that it's not the case, that basically architecture is totally embedded in the way our ecosystems are constructed, but we have to change the way we see them. We have to see them as entities that operate relationally, as entities that operate across scales, that entities that are performing. And it's in those jumps of scale, as objects transition across scales as entities that can operate as in those transitions where politics are embedded in architectural devices. This is the first rendering that was produced of this building, was actually a conceptual rendering that was produced by Dbox, the architectural firm specialized on architectural branding that is directed by Matthew Bannister. They were showing that basically buying an apartment in 432 allowed rich people, a little bit eccentric, to own the landscape, own the view. And this thing of owning the view, it's much more than just having a view or seeing a view or watching a view. It's much more embedded with the entanglements architecture is part of. Architecture is enacted through or by or us. This is Elizabeth, the harbor that basically voided the economy of Manhattan in the 1970s following the development of the standardized system for ship containers that was developed over the Vietnam War to provide logistics. And that huge transformation of the economy has been something that New York has been struggling, and Bloomberg and others were seeing real estate as the ultimate tool to bring back an economy to New York. And it's not by chance that Bloomberg would state that billionaires moving to New York would be godsend. And that was part, of course, of this whole economy that was promoting and making possible that apartments, condominiums would be acquired through LLC sole companies that could hide the ownership of the apartments, and also the historical tax deductions to billionaires when buying apartments on tax properties. When we see the way the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers were depicted, were depicting what a tax haven was actually very naive architecturally, since tax havens were depicted as these kind of tropical islands with kind of colonial architecture in them, simple houses. Whereas now we can see that when the European Union was trying to define what a tax haven was, basically they came up realizing that Hong Kong, the USA, Singapore, Luxembourg, Lebanon, Germany, Japan, Malaysia, Chile, the Netherlands, Guatemala, Belgium, Ireland, Brazil, Italy were actually tax havens. So the architecture of tax havens is not out there in the tropical islands, but is here. It's overlapped to the architecture that we produce. When we see the images where they come from, This is Jake Jackson, the owner and kind of ideologist of the porn studio Cocky Boys. Images like these that were the ones that were produced to solve these apartments, actually to invent them. The materials of this building were defined by D-Books, are coming from Cocky Boys, and that's something that we tracked by interviewing the people that were doing this rendering scene. And they were a way to sexualize architecture, as this image with Christina Makovsky with this shirtless tuxedo that was copied by D-Books from this Kim Kardashian image, and where this guy here is the only one that is not an actor, is the Danny DeVito guy that was introduced in the scene. He's a real businessman to show that by buying an apartment here, you could access the possibility of a kind of successful romantic story like this one. And when we look at this sky, it's so blue. Again, the details of architecture are crucial. The ultra clear glass that is used here is basically it's maximizing the presence of the visibility of the blue spectrum of the light. So basically you see through these windows and you see more blue. And it's produced with this very unique silica that is very, very rare. It's very white, and that basically multiplies the gas that is needed, the energy that is needed to produce glass, and increases by 10 times the NOx, 10 times the CO2, and 25 times the NOx that is emitted during the production of this glass. And that is fueled by fracking, basically. And that's not a new thing. It's not by accident. The development of the Chicago use of glass in architecture, flat glass, plate glass, was basically associated with the development of the canal, of the Illinois Canal, that would allow to mobilize first lumber, and then with the development of the dark gas exploitation of the Marcellus Shale that now is exploited through fracking, and it's associated with 30,000 miles of polluted aquifers. And still, and that is another conversation, just by using ultra clear glass in a building gives you 2 points of the LEED certificate. So architectural detailing is a form of socio-territorial recomposition. And this is the discussion that I wanted to bring to follow Lydia's discussion. What is the way architectural practices can be counter operating across scales, responding to the relational condition of climate, working as the possibility for complex ecosystems to be rendered critical and politically manageable. Yeah, thank you very much.
I think the question that Banham posed in 1990, and this specific text was written right before his death, so it was almost like a delirium of like a pre-mortem delirium, is not a very straightforward one. It's not a question of whether you keep something closed or open. And to me, I don't read this as a kind of attempt to make the process of design or architecture intelligible as a language or as an epistemic tradition that people can read and know how to in a seriality of steps. I think that's very important to clarify, because there's a very long legacy and genealogy of thinkers, including Christopher Alexander, including my old professor at MIT, George Steiny, who wrote shape grammars, and Negroponte, who tried to create a kind of language of architectural production. But I think the opening that Banham was referencing, or even if I might say that I, in my work, and possibly Andrés, is not necessarily an opening of the transparency of the steps that need to be taken within a kind of process of understanding, but an enlargement of the issues at stake and an understanding of a larger context within which we are all immersed in. And I think that's a very burdensome question for the person that opens it, right? For myself and for Andrés, because when you are confronted with all of these issues that are so complex, all of these multitudes, there's a kind of instant paralysis. And there's a kind of, how can I say, and this is all very informal, right? It's very hard to be both critical and generative of the world that we live in, right? And I think that's the fine line. That's what opening might mean. But I think that Banham, one of the things that he was trying to argue for throughout his career is to embrace not only the humanist tradition of architecture, which is, let's say, the genealogy of proportions, of language, of geometry, which was laid out by the modern movement, by Le Corbusier. And he wrote about that over and over again in a number of ways. But technology as the raw materiality of the world, the numbers not as technical elements, but a kind of enlarged reality within which we're embedded. He called that technology or science. So I think that it's a very fine line to be generative and critical, but I think that within the times that we live in, it's a question of survival, right? If we are not doing that, we're becoming irrelevant as a discipline, and the agency of what we can offer becomes irrelevant to the world. So I think it's not even a choice; it's an obligation.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel very close to these words. It's an obligation, and actually also is there's certain action of kind of dissidence with particular forms of constraint that are making it difficult also for architecture to operate in acknowledging that architecture is entangled with reality. So I would say that for me, it's also important to understand that this is part of a larger discussion of in the field of architecture, in which basically there's a number of devices that have been developed to avoid architecture to be self-aware of how entangled it is with many layers of reality. I must say that the metaphor of the black box that comes from cybernetics in a big part, it's a metaphor of how things are automatized, and there's an output and an input that are directly connected with the kind of illusion that could not be alternative relationship between them. And that is something that, of course, is being explored also in the realm of social sciences as what is the way that automatisms are produced collectively. And this is, of course, in the same context. This was developed in the studies of ethnomethodology in LA at the time that we're discussing. So it's basically in the 1970s where the notion of the black box, or kind of the construction of social institutions as automatisms that were mediated through technology was happening. And I think this is crucial because that's, in a way, a part of the legacy that we are challenging. And I would say, to be very clear, that what I believe that it's at stake, let's say, in this discussion is also a notion of architecture as situated. And that is, of course, a notion that comes from the tradition of feminism. And it's the idea that basically abstraction, it's not possible, basically, that it's exceeded by the specificity of reality, especially when realities that are highly evolving or kind of highly unstable unstable are being inquired, and basically there's a need to situate an experimental process to make it useful, or to make it emerge as real. I think the second thing is the notion of entanglement, and it's basically, that's crucial. Like I think Lydia's diagram of the shed actually was for me very beautiful, because it was showing how material is, or any material, and definitely fecal matter, it's the construction of an ecosystem, and can only be explained through this ecosystemical entanglements. And I think that when we see all these images of the poo train taking the fecal matter from New York, or the sewage, the material from the sewage, the matter from the sewage system to Alabama, and then getting connected and intersecting a racial segregation, or intersecting racial issues, and then also, of course, a territorial distribution of toxicity that is following patterns of value and property value. And like basically the realities we're probably discussing when we discuss climate and how our house is in fire are in the need of understanding any technology and any entity as entangled and not autonomous. And the third, I think, which is very important, is has to do with action and politics and experimentation, and how experimentation agency is distributed. And that's something that I found very interesting, what Lydia was explaining, that many of the cases that she's been looking at were experiments, where dissidence, error, was always part of the equation, and their trajectories were much more important than the initial intentions or the initial experimental protocols. And I think that we have to acknowledge that there's a need to develop tools to work with distributed agency, which is making things complicated and and obliges architecture to operate experimentally. And I think for me, these are fundamental changes that are kind of coming with the climatic paradigm that we're discussing.
Yes, I would. It's a really important question. And I think that especially during the pandemic, we have all become witnesses of the fact that the human body is the most powerful instrument of biopolitics. When there's climate change, when there was the idea of, let's say, an impending catastrophe that we could visualize in some near future, it was portrayed as an abstract phenomenon. But when there's an immediate reflection on the body, all of the reality and the canons of encounters, of the way that people interact, of the way that bodies relate and form spatial protocols change very abruptly and immediately. And this was astonishing to me, to see that within the course of so few days, 10 days, everything could change because the politics were endangering the body directly. So I think that in that way, Andrés said something in his lecture today that I thought was very important, that architecture, you said, Andrés, provides the medium where climate evolution or climate change is recorded, something like a filter that receives this change and this evolution. And then from that filter, the body is the second medium that receives that change. And I think it's extraordinarily important to look at space and architecture that way, because if we think of ecology and questions of ecological design in a post-war period, a lot of the examples that I have been investigating when I was writing Closed Worlds, the body was an immediate component, a part of the ecology itself. In the drawings that I have shown you, which were done for a self-sufficient project on Mars, it was a critique, but it was basically a self-sufficient, a decolonizing system. That's what I would calling it for Mars. The bodies were the generators for the energy, so they were immediately calculated within the system. And I think that this is an aspect that is entirely neglected and marginalized in discourses of sustainability today, how bodies are participants, active participants of an ecology of a space. We tend to conceptualize buildings as systems with devices, equipped with devices, performing on, or operating in a certain way, forgetting that our participation, our presence is what changes the climate in a space, right? If you have 100 people in one space, you rise immediately the CO2 in that space. If you have 100 people in a space with one infected from COVID-19, everybody gets infected, right? So there are so many literal ramifications as to occupation, to maintenance, to the discourse of care, which is something that in the post-humanities is very, let's say, trending right now as a theme, the issue of care, that I think questions of body politics are extraordinarily important and should definitely be reappropriated within ecological design discourses as an active part. It's not only about calculating solar panels and water filtration, but it's about actually imagining the presence and care and maintenance of the occupant, whatever that occupant, human or non-human.
Yeah, and I mean, I believe the discussion that Lydia has brought in relation, for instance, to Graham Crane's Eco House through the architecture of closed worlds, it's really relevant, because even the way, as you were saying, Lydia, now, like the way that you're representing architecture, introducing the body as part of it, and analyzing also the body not as stable or zipped up, I think it's, but really interdependent, interconnected to others, and constituted by otherness itself, it's crucial. I believe that there's two important issues here. The first is the fact that we can find in bodies the possibility of think togetherness in a way that technology, flesh, and environments are together, are found together. And I'm now, Nieves was referring to the Shanghai Biennale that I'm curating. And the topic of this Biennale is bodies of water, and comes from a very direct reference to Astida Neimani's work. And I love Astida Neimani's reading, which is part of this post-human feminism or post-human queer studies. Lydia has referred to some of them, of these traditions before. And the way body is not self-contained and is composed out of diversity, and it becomes actually a way to understand wet togetherness, and how through breathing, menstruating, sweating, decomposing, ejaculating, defecating, is basically how the world is connected and is constructed as a form of wet solidarity. For me, it's crucial. It's probably, and when we see architecture from this perspective, then architecture is really not something that could be, I mean, we could only think of architecture as something that is or imbricated in these forms of material solidarity. And by solidarity, I don't mean like the kind of the moral notion of solidarity, but rather the structural one, the one that basically brings, produces togetherness materially. And I think the second, it's, and on this, I would basically refer to Lydia's work on the construction of the human as a technological inquirer and even a corporate inquirer, and that you presented, for instance, in Istanbul Biennale that you referred to. In my opinion, we see that we're at the time that architecture is becoming less obvious. It's much more embedded in the way genes are transformed and manipulated, or kind of engineered and crafted, vaccines, training, learning, ontologies. And this is crucial. If we try to find the devices or the technologies that are doing what architecture did in the past, we see that are very much operating within these forms of wet togetherness. We will see at one point a vaccine for COVID-19, and that vaccine will start to create transformations like PrEP. I think PrEP is a crucial example, like basically what was happening in dark rooms in the 80s, it's happening now in bodily transformation that is asymmetrically being used by gay men mostly to protect themselves from HIV AIDS. And I think that is replacing entire architecture that was deployed through buildings. And for me, this is a huge shift in our profession.
We cannot escape technology. We are technology. Like we live inside it. We are also technology. Our bodies are constructed of different microplastics, and they're part of our DNA. So for me, it's not a question of creating a distance from technology or disposing of the technology, but of imagining possibly a different way of understanding the world, which is not quantified, or sustainability and ecological discourses without the epistemic dimension of metrics only, exclusively. Mm-hmm. And I think it's extraordinarily important to do this, to imagine, not imagine architecture or buildings that build environment without technology. This is something that will not happen, cannot happen, and I wonder if we want it to happen. It's a question of imagining an existential way of being with technology, and of imagining not just a system of metrics, a checklist that provides a performance, but a different modality of living. So that'll be my short answer, and I'm sure Andrés has more to say on that.
I totally agree.
More to say on that.
I totally agree. I basically think that, basically I think the idea of humans domaining through technology, nature, probably we can discuss all these words, humans, domain, technology, and nature, and we see that they don't make sense basically as independent concepts. So the possibility of understanding them as mutually intersecting, I think is crucial. Like basically, and then I would like to stop now in domain, because who domains who, it's very important in the discourse of the politics of emancipation. But when we look more carefully, there's mutual exploitation somehow being built through the way structures of domain are constructed, and I think this is crucial because in a way, one of the most important critiques to the notions of Anthropocene came at the same time from very high thinkers and from kind of people that were reporting on the actual meetings where the politics of Anthropocene were being defined. And one of them was basically coming from Rosi Braidotti, that was saying, who is the anthropo on the Anthropocene? Because I'm not that anthro. I'm actually quite a victim. I would place myself on the side of nature in this narrative, like it's the wrong narrative in a way to think that humans have been imposing or neglected nature, and then nature is responding. We have to understand that we're part of an entanglement that it's facing particular processes that are not equally affecting all the parts of these ecosystems we're part of, and that it's creating inequalities and frictions. But in a way, in order to address it, we have to acknowledge the complexity of the interdependency that we're part of. The second came from journalists that were reporting on the meetings where the policies or the kind of response to Anthropocene would be defined, and they say, well, there are only men here. So I guess the Anthropocene are men and not women, or not queer people, or not, you know, trans, or non-binary people. So the question is also how the violence of climate crisis is applied to the very notion of humans, and what is the way that humans can evolve by facing those tensions. I think it's very important. I don't think it's an accident that challenging binarisms, it's growing, and not only as a trend, but a kind of collective experiment. And I think it's not by accident, because basically at the same time that we're experimenting a huge shift in the way we constitute ourselves as climate, we are climate, we perform climate, we are experiencing, we need to experience the way human body is enacted collectively. And that, for me, it's two parts of the same process of changing or shifting our cultures, our sensitivities, our bodies, our the way we are planet, in a way.